continue on looking at icons of evolution, kind of book of Jonathan Wells, evolutionary biologist. As you can look at the previous video introducing that topic. First icon of evolution that he looks at, and that we're going to look at, is the Miller-Urey Experiment in 1952-53. And the icon is actually over here on my screen on the left. This contraption that has the water and the heat in this unit where there's an electrode and a spark and these different gases going through it. And the idea here to see whether life could be created in a lab if they took what they assumed to be the primitive conditions of the primeval Earth and duplicated them. Their goal was to see if they could get to leaving that alone to the point where amino acids, the building blocks of the proteins of life, would be created, to see if they could generate that creation of life in a laboratory. Let's say that they did do that. First of all, let's say that they were able to duplicate these conditions and show that they could create life in the laboratory. You can even hear in my language, and I guess I could phrase it differently, but the fact that scientists have to put together with intelligence, with specific plan, with a very specific circumstances that they are in as much control of as can be possible, and then they call that the spontaneous, generation of life from non-living materials is dubious at best. That the fact is that they're the ones in control of this experiment. Now, if they can duplicate what they believe to be the set of conditions that were present in the primeval world according to them, and living material, the amino acids, the right amino acids come forth from this, then that would be evidence for the idea of life generating those original conditions. The other picture I put here, it's actually a video. I'm not going to play it, but it's the Rite of Spring. This is from the original Fantasia from Disney, and it's 21 minutes long. It's this music playing, and I actually didn't like Fantasia. I thought it was kind of boring. But anyway, the Rite of Spring is this orchestra playing this music, and then it's video like the Big Bang, and zooming into Earth and the volcanic activities you can see here, and then the cooling and the rains, and then these small organisms forming, and then they kind of become fish, and they kind of grow legs, and then they kind of become different, and it goes through this, and then it gets struck by a meteor, and it kind of ends and kind of quiets down again. So very long video, 21 minutes of this music, but that's kind of the idea. That's very common to see. I believe there was even a Simpsons, instead of following the usual introduction theme song, it had it start like that, with him, Homer crawling out of the water as this creature, and then kind of evolving and changing, and then becoming a man, all this stuff. Okay, so what did this experiment claim? What did it actually prove? And then how was that? How were the results used afterward? Okay, so the Miller-Urey experiment, and Miller and Urey, the scientists involved, I'll talk about them in a minute, claimed to demonstrate the creation of biological life from conditions simulating a primeval environment with chemicals and a spark to simulate lightning. as can be seen from this picture. Darwin, in Origin of Species and his other writings, did not speak to the issue of the origin of life, but he said in a letter that he imagined it coming from some warm little this chemical uh, soup, eventually creating the simplest biological organisms. The problem or problems from this is no one really claims to know, no evolutionary scientists, no one really claims to know that they know definitively where life came from. Now, I'm creationist, I'm a biblical presuppositionalist. God created the world. Okay, there's the living God created life. There's no debate in that for me. But what they're claiming is not that they know where life came from, because one of the scientific laws is the law of biogenesis, and that is life only comes from living things. So if you philosophically follow that back to a beginning, where does it come from? And there's all kinds of speculation and theories and idea around that. Darwin and others imagine some warm little pond, kind of like the Rite of Spring video that I just showed or just talked about. That it's life in its simplest form originated there and continued to evolve through a process of natural selection. Okay, so the original theory was first hypothesized in the 1920s by a Russian scientist named Oparin and a British scientist named Haldane. They suggested that lightning in the primitive atmosphere striking like the water could have produced the chemical building blocks of life. They suggested a hot, dilute soup from which the first cells could emerge. So the soup thing is not something I'm saying in a derogatory way. It's been said by scientists who were suggesting this theory. The Miller-Urey experiment happened in the 1950s, really 1952, 1953. It was an untested hypothesis, this idea of the chemical soup, the water, the rains, and the lightning, and these chemicals producing the first cells. In the 50s is when they first began testing this idea. So it's tested by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, and they were able to produce some of the building blocks of life, amino acids, by sending an electric spark through a mixture of gases in this contraption that they created. Correct this typo here. This sparked excitement and then appeared in almost every college and high school textbook. And this was showing or purporting to show that life was created in a lab, or that the original conditions of the earth were able to be simulated, and it was shown that life was able to emerge from those conditions. Maybe to put it in a different way, here's some problems with the Miller-Urey experiment, and these are all well documented. And the footnotes on this can be seen as well if you want to do some further research and reading. It's believed, now there's still a lot of debate on this, and there was debate at the time and following, that Earth has always had an oxygen-rich environment. There's oxidized rock at very low levels, and there was a debate about whether oxygen was there or not. The problem is organic molecules, like the building blocks of life, amino acids, and the building blocks of the cells, as counterintuitive as it might sound, and I'm not a scientist, I'm just reading this stuff for myself, but as counterintuitive as it might sound, they cannot really develop in an oxygen-rich environment because they will oxidize, just like that's another way to say something. When metal oxidizes, that's what we call rust. Rocks oxidize. If you open a banana and it's exposed to oxygen, it will start to oxidize, or we see it as going bad. But the experiment excluded oxygen. So one of their key assumptions was that there was no oxygen, and they knew if they allowed in oxygen that the experiment would not work. Okay, so that is one problem, is that they're making this assumption that there was no oxygen in the primitive um, atmosphere, though there's still a lot of debate over whether that was present or not in those scientific circles. They also assumed an atmosphere of ammonia, methane, and other gases. Gases, the problem is if you assume that there's no oxygen, if there had been oxygen, it would have caused the amino acids to oxidize and would have broken them up. But the problem is if there was oxygen, it would create this ozone layer that blocks some of the radioactive or the ultraviolet light from the sun. Without that, if there is no oxygen, that means the ultraviolet light from the sun is shining onto this primitive environment. That means it would decompose gases like ammonia, and they would be present in the rock layers, but ammonia is not present in the rock layers. So here's the problem. They assume ammonia. Number two, their assumption is they assume an atmosphere that's high in ammonia. But by also assuming that there was no oxygen, the radioactive ultraviolet light would have eliminated that ammonia. So they assumed no oxygen. Okay, that's a big assumption. And they assumed ammonia, but both of those are extremely problematic. The experiment did produce some type of amino acids, but it produced right-handed amino acids and left-handed amino acids. The problem with this is that only left-handed amino acids make up the building blocks of life, the building blocks of the proteins necessary to life. If you have just one right-handed amino acid, it cancels out and eliminates the effects of all the others, as far as I understand it. So it didn't matter. Yes, some synthetic chemicals or organic components were created in a lab. Number one, assumed an oxygen-free environment, which would not have been possible or would have been highly debated. They excluded oxygen, big assumption. Number two, they allow in ammonia, but if you exclude oxygen, that ammonia would not be able to survive under the ultraviolet light of the sun and the radioactivity. Number three, they produce left-handed amino acids, which could potentially say something in the direction that they want their experiment to go, but they also produce right-handed amino acids, which cancels out the potential for the emergence of life completely. Okay, so this experiment is very limited in what it was able to demonstrate. Another scientist, set of scientists, Clemmy and Badham, in their study, Oxygen in the Precambrian Atmosphere, an evaluation of the geologic evidence, say, from the time of the earliest rocks at 3.7 billion years ago, Earth had an oxygenic atmosphere. So that assumption kind of blows away or puts major holes in the Miller-Urey experiment. So assuming an early atmosphere without oxygen, they described it, I didn't use this word, but these scientists did, as a dogma, not a science. Now, a dogma is something that you believe, in this context, something that you believe because it's more and something that you're supposed to believe rather than something you're looking at the evidence and seeing you don't have any particular bias one way or the other. The Miller-Urey experiment only succeeded in synthesizing organic molecules in a laboratory. But the problem with that is scientists had been doing that for years. That was nothing special. Of course, if you put the right conditions together, you can synthesize organic molecules in a laboratory. That doesn't demonstrate the emergence of life in a primitive atmosphere. So the experiment did not prove the origin of life in a primitive atmosphere. However, once the results of this paper were published, it was taken almost immediately into high school, college textbooks, pamphlets, National Geographic, other such publications, and this picture was used to demonstrate that life could emerge from a primitive atmosphere. So that was the theory. This now provides the picture that puts in people's minds the model of how something might have happened. And even though it wasn't true or misrepresented, not Miller and Urey necessarily, but the use of this picture misrepresented what was actually demonstrated by the experiment. People were being led to believe something with evidence that was not true. Now, whether or not you believe the evolutionary model, you believe that evolution is true or not, this evidence is not true and is not uh, representative of proof of evolution. So even if the theory of evolution is true, misrepresentation and lies should not be used to make people think that there's evidence that there isn't, that this is not evidence for evolution, and it's been proven wrong and recognized to be so by scientists for many years. However, it has not caught up to the textbooks, and this is still seen as the model giving evidence for the theory of that primitive atmosphere and that emergence of original biological life. Jonathan Wells writes on this, although geochemists were sharply divided on the oxygen issue, they soon reached a near consensus that the primitive atmosphere was nothing like the one Miller used. So even though there was still a divide over whether or not there was oxygen, how much, what time, oxygen was present there or whether it wasn't, it didn't matter because eventually, as scientists went further and studied more, and geochemists looked at the chemistry, looked at the rocks, looked at the layers, they determined that the primitive atmosphere could be nothing like the one that Miller and Urey were assuming. And so this experiment, though it may have had noble purposes in the beginning to try to demonstrate something, should have been discarded a long time ago as not proving anything. Jonathan Wells goes on and says the conclusion is clear. If the Miller-Urey experiment is repeated using a realistic simulation of Earth's primitive atmosphere, it doesn't work. Therefore, origin of life researchers have to look elsewhere. So if they still want to develop that theory and develop models, that's as far as it goes, is looking for evidence, okay. But the fact of the matter is this is not proof of anything that we are told that it is in the textbooks. However, according to the National Academy of Sciences, this is still used. The Miller-Urey experiment still misleads students, teachers, the average public today in things like National Geographic. The 1998 March issue of National Geographic published a picture of Miller standing next to the experiment talking about the theory of how life emerged from that primitive atmosphere, and then several pages later talks about, gives a disclaimer about how the experiment of Miller and Urey is no longer thought to be the best model or accurate. The National Academy of Sciences booklet called Science and Creationism, A View from the National Academy of the Sciences from 1999, so about 20 years old, says that experiments conducted under conditions intended to resemble those present on primitive Earth have resulted in the production of some of the chemical components DNA and RNA. The problem with that statement is it's using the Miller-Urey experiment, which is really the only experiment like this of that kind, which was not able to demonstrate what is being claimed here. Somebody reading this would say, okay, well, in a lab this was demonstrated that this is how it happened, and it makes it sound as if the evidence has already been settled, even though this is not the case. To make the problem worse, the National Academy of Sciences was commissioned by Congress in 1863 to advise the government on scientific matters. So it's a proponent of the then Lincoln is president, and the Civil War government creates funding for a lot of these different types of programs. And this is the body that is advising the US government on scientific matters. And it's still using outdated by 50 years misrepresentations of so-called evidence to try to prove its point. So if he wants to prove a point, that's fine. But what's not fine is trying to use evidence that is not even recognized by the scientific community in order to prove a certain worldview. So misrepresentations like the Miller-Urey experiment are still being used as evidence for evolution. And if the evidence for evolution is there, then fine. Then let's replace those things in the textbooks, or at least put a disclaimer on them saying that this is not accurate on a certain page, or crossing those things out. But uh, I highly doubt that most people will want to do that, because looking at this will look like taking a crack at evolutionary theory in general. But why should lies be used to support a theory that is supposed to be so obviously true that no one scientifically minded can deny it? Lastly, let me just finish with this quote by a chemist named Robert Shapiro. He believes in evolution, and he says from 1986, "We have reached a situation where a theory has been accepted as fact by some, and possible contrary evidence is presented